Hi everybody. Today we are back with another building history video in The Sims. This time I'm recreating the home of a very famous journalist and activist, Ida B. Wells-Barnett. And I'm recreating her home in Chicago, which you can see up here on the screen. And Ida B. Wells-Barnett, I'm just going to call her Ida for most of this video, but she was a very famous African American journalist known for her activist work against lynching and for her role in promoting civil rights and women's suffrage. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on her and her story and a lot of the great stuff she did. Just to make sure everyone's aware, there are some heavy topics I talk about in this video. So if you are uncomfortable with hearing about um, the violence that's happened in American history, just giving you a heads up now. So if you want to click off the video, uh, just giving you a little warning. So let's get back to Ida. Ida B. Wells was born in Mississippi. So Ida was born in 1862 in Mississippi, just 3 years before the end of the Civil War. And Ida's parents, their names were Elizabeth and James. Both of them had been born into slavery, but of course, once the Civil War ended in 1865, they were free, and of course, their daughter Ida was free as well. And her parents were really committed to making sure their kids were educated and had all the freedoms that they had, of course, never been able to enjoy growing up. So Ida, as well as her siblings, were well educated, and her father, James, was actually involved in the founding of Shaw University, which was later renamed Rusk College in Mississippi. It was Mississippi's first black college, and it's still open today as a historically black college. So her father was, played a part in helping start the university. And she actually attended the university for a time. But later on, when she was 16 years old in 1878, her parents and one of her younger siblings died in a yellow fever outbreak. So that left Ida to take on caring for herself and her six younger siblings. So at 16, she got a job as a teacher to help support them, and she worked as a teacher for several years until her brothers were able to take care of themselves through carpentry. And then Ida moved herself with her younger sisters up to live in Memphis, Tennessee with their aunt in 1882. And while she was there, Ida got another teaching job. And she also attended Fisk University for a while, which is another historically black college which is still in operation today. So while she was a teacher, Ida was also becoming active as a journalist at this time. So she was starting to write articles for newspapers while she continued her teaching career. And in her writings, at some points, she criticized the Memphis school system for how the schools that were educating black children were how they were, subpar to the schools that were educating white children. And she reported on how the school board was underfunding the black schools in Memphis. And this led to Ida being fired from her teaching job in 1891. So after she published that article, she got in trouble with the school board and she lost her job um, for her journalism. And that sort of kind of continued a theme throughout her life where she would be very outspoken in her journalism and really didn't hold back in really telling the truth in her journalism, and it got her into a lot of trouble. But it was, a very good thing that she was, because she was really speaking out about issues that were going on that other people didn't really want to acknowledge. So that happened when she got fired. That was in 1891. One thing that happened to her that was really significant in her life happened in 1884. So at this point, she was still a school teacher. While she was on a train ride from Memphis, Ida had purchased a first class ticket for the train ride, and she was told while she was riding the train that she had to go sit in the smoker's car, which at that point was being used as a segregated car. So she refused to leave her seat, and she ended up being dragged from her seat and by some of the crew members on the train. And in the struggle, she even bit one of the men trying to throw her off the train. So after that happened, Ida actually sued the railroad company for damages, and she actually won the case, and she received $500 as a settlement. Unfortunately, the case ended up being overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court, but the train incident really sparked her career as a journalist, and she started publishing articles under her pen name Iola. And that was one episode that really, set her on her lifelong career of journalism. So Ida kept fighting for equal treatment, and she became a full-time journalist after she had been fired from her teaching job, and she eventually became part owner and editor of two black-owned newspapers in Tennessee. And this was the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, and another newspaper called Free Speech. 1892 was another really important year in Ida's life and career, and this is an episode where I will be talking about lynching, so just making sure you're aware if you want to click off the video or something at that point. But in 1862, in the area that she lived in, three black businessmen were lynched. So the three men owned a grocery store, and they were seen as a threat by the white-owned grocery store that was also in the same town. So the white grocery store owner and his supporters would come after the new black-owned grocery store, and at one point the black grocery store owners had to like guard their store from attack every night, and in one struggle one evening, several of the white men were shot while they were attacking the store. So the three men were arrested, and while they were in jail, a white mob came and dragged the men from prison and killed them. So this lynching really shook Ida. Of course, she knew that this was already happening, but she knew the three men that had been killed, and she was even really close friends with one of the men. And if you don't already know what lynching is, it's a public killing of a person that happens outside the normal means of the justice system. So this was in the United States, it's a form of racial terrorism that's been used to intimidate and control blacks in America. And lynchings had happened during the time of slavery in the United States, but it really took off after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era, when many blacks were making a lot of political and economic progress, so like starting businesses, running for public office, going to school, and making their way in public life when, of course during slavery times that wasn't possible for them. So lynchings a lot of times were kind of a way to control people and make blacks afraid of being able to in their being able to do the things that a lot of white people didn't want them to do. And they felt lynchings were a way to control people, essentially. And they were often carried out by a mob, who often claimed that the victim was guilty of some crime that was usually like a made up crime or something really minor and petty. So these were very brutal killings, and a lot of times crowds of whites would attend these lynchings as if they were public entertainment. And, in some places it was like a whole big show, and it was, seen as like this, entertaining spectacle to them. And, blacks who had sort of in some way stepped out of line and, were not following, I guess, the way that whites in the southern whites in that society wanted black people to act like, those were people that were often victims because they were threatening to the social order in some way. So the three grocery store owners that had opened their store were typical victims of this type of crime. So there's a lot more to be said about this, and I'll leave some information in the description box if you want to learn more about lynching and the history of lynching in the United States. So after that happened in 1892, Ida really turned the focus of her journalism to lynching. So she started publishing a lot of articles attacking lynchings and bringing a lot of more attention to the issue. And she attacked a lot of the flimsy justifications that whites would use for lynchings. And she wrote about that in her newspaper and questioned the sort of often common excuse that lynchings were a way to sort of avenge attacks against white women's so-called virtue. So that was often the justification for a lot of these lynchings. And she wrote that they were an excuse to get rid of those who were trying to acquire wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized, as how she put it. So, so she was really going after, uh, giving attention to the issue and then talking about the, you know, reasons that were often given for these brutal murders. So whites were obviously extremely outraged by her articles, and especially the article that she put out after the lynching of the three grocery store owners. And she received physical threats. Her friends and family were also threatened. At that point, she was out of town in New York City, and when she was out of town, her newspaper office was attacked and burned, and the threats became so bad that she was forced to leave Memphis. So from then on, she only lived in northern cities like New York and Chicago, and she even changed her pen name to Exiled. So Ida continued her campaign against lynching even after she moved out of Memphis, and she really became sort of the premier voice against lynching in the United States. And she documented over 700 cases of lynchings across the South. And she was writing a lot about the many false accusations the lynch mobs used to justify their actions. She began working in a New York City newspaper where she published an entire collection of anti-lynching articles that were named the Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And she published that in 1892. And in 1893, she was actually invited by a women's group that was in England to actually go over to England and Scotland and deliver lectures against lynching. So she went over there and she did a whole tour talking to the people in Europe about lynching and what was going on. And in 1895, she published another set of articles about lynching called Red Record: Lynchings in the United States. And this was the first documented statistical report on lynching, where she dived into the history of the practice since the Civil War and provided really detailed evidence and numbers about the numbers of people that were being lynched across the United States. So that was really important because the way she gathered her information was by reading newspapers from across the country that reported on lynchings that maybe have reported one or two people, and she would collect that information and then report it in her collection of essays. So that really helped give more information on lynchings for the greater public. In 1898, she brought the anti-lynching cause to the White House and called on the then President William McKinley to address lynching. So she petitioned the president to find those responsible for killing a black postmaster and his daughter in North Carolina. And President McKinley had the Justice Department actually investigate the lynching, but the case ended in a mistrial, and the Justice Department just stopped pursuing the matter. And so, you know, Ida, of course, was very disappointed by that, and of course, the family of the man that and his daughter that had been killed never got their justice really in that situation. But Ida really kept pressing the issue, so she was calling for legislative reforms to address lynching. She was lobbying Congress to get a national anti-lynching law, and at this point in time, there was one black member of Congress, and his name was George White from North Carolina, and he presented a bill for federal anti-lynching law to the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, his bill failed, and it became the first of 200 attempts at a federal lynching law. And that was just the first, attempt at passing some kind of legislation against lynching. And it took over 100 years for the United States to pass a national anti-lynching law. And that only happened in 2020. And it started in 1898. So it's, wild that it took that long for something to happen. So Ida would, continuously over the years petition different presidents to stand up against lynching. So McKinley had, had the Justice Department investigate that specific lynching that she had told him about, and he was sympathetic to the cause, but he didn't really do anything about it. And the same thing happened when she reached out to Theodore Roosevelt, the next president William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson for action against lynching. And Roosevelt and Taft were also sympathetic to the anti-lynching cause, but none of them did anything to address it. So they kind of, like Roosevelt, he was very, he thought it was, a very barbaric practice, and he did not support it, but he also did nothing to try to address the matter. And Taft as well was also of the same mindset, but neither of them really felt comfortable standing up to what was going on. And part of that was the fear of alienating people from southern states who were more of the mindset that lynching was okay. So nothing was really done about it. And although Ida was really best known for her fight against lynching, she was also active in a lot of other civil rights causes, and she was a very outspoken advocate for women's suffrage. And suffrage means the right to vote. So at that point, women could not vote. Women could not vote in the United States on the national level until 1919. So Ida was very active in working with other women to try to promote suffragism, to promote suffrage and promote the right to vote. In 1896, she formed a new civil rights organization, the National Association of Colored Women, and that organization was, of course, committed to civil rights, but also committed to getting women the right to vote. So she helped found a couple of other organizations that were focused on civil rights and women's suffrage. And she even helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is known as the NAACP. And that organization was founded in 1910. She is not listed as a formal founder of the organization, but she played a very important role in helping start that organization. And of course, the NAACP is still around today. And of course, she was also speaking out against segregation that was becoming a much bigger thing throughout the South, at the end of the 19th century, and of course, moving into the early 20th century. She spoke and she met with Woodrow Wilson about that in 1913. And she also, wrote to him talking about the discrimination and segregation that black soldiers were facing in the Army during World War II. So, as I said before, she was very active in the women's suffrage movement, and she co-founded another group called the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago in 1913, which eventually went on to become the largest black women's suffrage organization in Illinois. At that time, she was living in Chicago, so she was very active in the political scene out there. And that organization advocated for women's suffrage. They pushed to have black candidates in office, and they also taught a lot of women how they could be politically active at that point in time. And she also marched in the 1913 Women's March in Washington, D.C. And that was the first national parade for women's suffrage. If you look up, the Women's March, it was like a very big thing in 1913, and she was part of that. And Ida and a lot of other black women had planned to participate in the Women's March, but when some other suffragettes, that mostly from southern states, found out that there were going to be black women in the parade with them, they refused to march with them. And the march organizers unfortunately just caved to the pressure of that and said that, the black women could march in the parade, but they had to do it separately and they had to be at the back. And Ida just would not go along with that segregated march. So, what she ended up doing, she waited for the whole march to start. And while the parade went by, she snuck in at the front of the parade and marched with the first section went at the top of the parade. So she was always, doing stuff like that where she was not just gonna go along with, what people had set out for her. Especially in terms of people trying to push segregation. And she continued to stay active in politics throughout her entire life, even running for the Illinois State Senate when she was older, at a point when women could not vote still. And she died in Chicago in March 1931. And almost 70 years after her death, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her bold reporting on lynching. And of course, the national anti-lynching law Ida had fought so hard for in the 1890s and then, the 1910s and beyond. That law was finally signed into law in 2020. And her Chicago home right now is listed as a National Historic Landmark. And, so Ida lived a really full life. She was very active in a lot of political movements and played a huge role in, giving, even historians today, will use information that Ida collected at the time while she was alive about lynching. That information is still something that's used right now to learn about what was happening. So she played a really important part in her time and had a big impact even today on civil rights. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the house in general because obviously this is a Sims building video even though we're talking about a historical figure. So her home in Chicago, she had moved to Chicago in 1893 and she had married an attorney. His name was Ferdinand Barnett. The couple had 4 children, but she was still very active in her work and her journalism while she was raising her kids. And they moved into this house in Chicago in 1919 and lived there till 1929, so for about a 10-year period. And the house itself was built in a late 19th century style, and it was done in this Romanesque revival style, which is also known as the Richardsonian Romanesque style. And it was supposed to be reminiscent of like French cathedrals and like medieval French architecture, so it has a lot of that kind of like heavy features and heaviness to the architecture. And that was a very popular architectural style in the American Midwest at the end of the 19th century. And it's characterized by these heavy, rough cut stones, these, squat columns, and recessed windows. And the house also incorporates elements of the Queen Anne style of architecture, which was also popular at that time. And it would include a lot of like rich but simple ornamentation and these expansive porches. And her home is located on the south side of Chicago, and it's you know, at like you would see maybe in a lot of like northern cities in this kind of uh, urban row house look. So that's the reason why I made a second house to it right next door to kind of give that like row house appearance. So it's a National Historic Landmark, like I said before, and it was very typical of the sort of the urban row houses that were made in the late Victorian time frame. Although the house was, of course, built in the 19th century, Ida and her family lived there in from like really about the 1920s. So I furnished the interior with a lot of 1920s style decor and touches. So at that point in time, the art styles or like the furniture styles and also, other decorative styles that were popular at that point in time were Art Deco, of course, but also another one called Art no Nova. It's a French word, so I'm probably mispronouncing it. But Art Nouveau was a style that had came right before Art Deco and was popular, during and a little bit after World War One. So that design was inspired by like plants and flowers and had a lot of soft flowing lines and geometric shapes. And then of course Art Deco came right after and was very popular in the 20s. And that style has a lot of sleek lines and emphasized symmetry and was also very inspired by like nature designs. So it's kind of hard, of course, to find furniture in The Sims that's, you know, copying that, but a lot of the furniture in Realm of Magic had sort of Art Deco and Art Nouveau styles in it, so I tried to use a lot of that furniture. I spent most of the time in the kitchen fixing that up because I was trying to create something that resembled the 1920s style kitchens. I cut out all of the furnishings I did on the upstairs just because it was just filling in some space. But as you can see now, when we do the walkthrough, you'll see all the other bedrooms that I had and the other bathrooms. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed learning about Ida B. Wells-Barnett. I left links in the description to read more about her life and get some other information. And then, of course, the resources on lynching and the history of that in the US. So thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can see the next video on building history. Bye!